On December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air and submarine attack on the American military dock at Honolulu called Pearl Harbor. This seemingly small surprise attack upended the everyday American citizen's mindset of relative peace and security and sent shockwaves throughout the world. This attack marked the start of the long and bloody war we know today as the Pacific War, a part of the larger and even more complicated Second World War. The Pacific War saw brutal atrocities committed by both sides, with millions of both military and civilian casualties. This war, the first of the United States in over 30 years, and one of Japan's many in the decade leading up to the attack, saw an outmatched US Navy facing a superior Japanese fleet. Coming off such an emotionally and physically devastating loss, to win the war, the US had to come up with new and innovative strategies and technologies to avoid defeat.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
At 7:55 a.m., a wave of Japanese bombers appeared on the horizon over the American-controlled island of Honolulu. The Americans, caught completely unaware, scrambled to stop them, but all they could do was watch as the Japanese blew up ship after ship docked in the military base in Pearl Harbor, sending many ships along with their crew to their underwater graves. Wave after wave of planes decimated everything on the ground, unleashing utter hell on the military harbor below. The Japanese left with over 19 ships sunk or damaged, 330 planes hit, and over 2,500 Americans killed or wounded. As infamous as it was, the attack on Pearl Harbor was more of a diversion for the Japanese aggressors, done to quickly cripple the American fleet before they began a wider invasion of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. At the same time as the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, the American-occupied Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. All 4 operations were successful. For example, in the Philippines alone, the underprepared and ill-equipped Americans were quickly overwhelmed. With over 78,000 Allied soldiers captured during the invasion, the Japanese forced them all to walk 65 miles across the island of Luzon in 6 days. Sick, starving, and injured, the Japanese beat and killed whoever fell out of line. Over 10,000 prisoners of war died along the way in what became known as the Bataan Death March, which was a horrible event that angered and motivated the American people, and combined with the unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor, also made them more accepting of treating the Japanese army and its civilians terribly in return. Unlike other losses of overseas territories, Pearl Harbor itself was not as physically damaging to the US in the long run, instead causing widespread shock across the country and motivating Americans to violently strike back. The Japanese, focusing on a quick and easy way to cripple the American Navy, did not target naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine bases, and missed their opportunity to hit America's aircraft carriers, which proved to be a decisive factor in the battle for the Pacific. In addition, the USA was already an industrial and economic powerhouse, meaning that it was easily able to replenish any ships lost during the attack and the broader war, and the Americans sure did use their industrial might to do so. One of the things that made the Axis powers so powerful during World War II, especially Japan, was their unconventional military doctrine. In Japan, death was considered more honorable than defeat in battle. So their military consisted of personnel trained specifically in suicide attacks, such as kamikaze pilots who crashed their planes into enemy ships, fortifications, and personnel to inflict more casualties. The USA's military doctrine was just the same as those of other Allied powers, which had been invented in World War I and not updated since. So far, such doctrine of a traditional cautious attacking and defensive strategies turned out well for them, recruiting in numerous defeats at the hands of the Japanese. American generals understood clearly that they needed new and unconventional tactics of their own to outmaneuver the Japanese if they wanted a chance at ending the war. At the time, the war in the Pacific was being fought for many small islands that were often heavily fortified by the Japanese. Many soldiers were killed in brutal fighting aimed at taking only small tracts of land to get slightly closer to mainland Japan. The battle for one such island, Iwo Jima, lasted over a month and led to the death of 45,000 people on both sides and the loss of 153 airplanes. This hardly fought island is only 8 square miles in size. To avoid absurd battles like these, MacArthur devised a strategy in which his forces go around the islands to invade other islands that may be less fortified, therefore cutting off the target islands from supply lines and reinforcements. This strategy, which became known as leapfrogging, allowed the Americans to take the islands easily or ignore them and leave the Japanese forces on those islands stranded until the end of the war. Although only General MacArthur and Admiral William Hazley chose to apply the strategy, it enabled them to capture New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, and numerous other islands with relative ease. However, to utilize this strategy effectively, the Americans needed a new way to weaken defenses on islands and halt construction of new ships and planes to reinforce these islands. That is where the B-29 Superfortress came in. After World War I, the usefulness of planes in military strategy became apparent. Their nature of flight over terrain and most grounded defenses meant that they could provide aerial support to ground forces and could drop bombs on enemy fortifications. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, it became clear that the United States needed to develop new fighters capable of opposing the Japanese warplanes such as the A-6M0. The American fleet at the time was relatively out of date due to the fact the US had not fought any war since World War I, so few new advancements had been made since then. Meanwhile, the Japanese continued to make new warplanes that outmatched their American counterparts. On September 21st, 1942, Boeing's B-29 Superfortress would make its maiden flight, being the heaviest plane in production, with a wingspan totaling 141 feet and 3 inches. America's new bomber would level the playing field of the war. Superfortresses utilized a pressurized cabin so the bomber could be deployed for high-altitude strategic bombing as well as for firebombing from a low altitude. The plane's incredible range of 5,500 miles allowed the Superfortress to bomb enemy fortifications and even the Japanese mainland itself. It did this all while defending itself with its multiple remotely controlled defensive cannons, allowing it to protect itself from enemy fighters. This aircraft proved decisive, allowing Americans to carry out huge bombing runs on Japanese fortification and mainland Japan, and even used by the Allies in the fight for Europe. Much of the use in both Europe and Japan was imprecise carpet bombing to cause maximum damage to military and civilian infrastructure. This was part of the newer Allied doctrine of trying to win the war at whatever cost. In part, a reaction to the ruthless atrocities committed by the Japanese with Pearl Harbor and the Bataan Death March, prompting the United States to do the same. Both this changed the doctrine as well as the capability to bomb mainland Japan, allowing for the next step to be put in place, finally bringing an end to the war, the atomic bomb. In 1938, a group of physicists working at a laboratory in Berlin, Germany, discovered something big: nuclear fission. Nuclear fission is a process of the nucleus of an atom of radioactive substance suddenly splitting into multiple smaller nuclei, releasing a large amount of energy in the process. Scientists quickly realized the huge potential of this discovery, and quickly both sides rushed to develop the first atomic bomb to gain the upper hand in the war. On August 13, 1942, the President of the US, Franklin D. Roosevelt, launched the Manhattan Project, authorizing $500 million for the development of this new type of weapon. One design for the atomic bomb contained 2 chunks of radioactive uranium-235. Upon detonation, one of the chunks is fired at the other within the bomb with enough force to trigger multiple fission reactions within the chunks. The resulting outburst of energy could cause destruction on a scale never before comprehensible by humanity. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was tested in New Mexico. The result of this test detonation was so shocking that upon seeing the detonation, the leader of the Manhattan Project himself, J. Robert Oppenheimer, called a line from a Hindu scripture called the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." On August 6, 1945, President Harry S. Truman, hearing of Japanese refusal to surrender, ordered an atomic bomb to be dropped on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, another one was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Overall, between 129,000 and 226,000 people were killed by the 2 bombings, each killing tens of thousands in mere seconds. However, 5 days after the Hiroshima bombing, Japan officially surrendered, ending their decades-long conquest throughout Southeast Asia. World War II, in particular the Pacific War, was a long and bloody war that saw some of the newest and even oldest military technologies take shape in battle. These technologies and strategies changed in the course of the war, enabling the United States to triumph over its enemies. But while these technologies reshaped the Pacific War, it influenced not only the future of all military technology in wars, but also would influence many aspects of life outside of just war. For example, a tense political climate after World War II, fueled by the invention of nuclear weapons, led to the Cold War, a decades-long rivalry between the two superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union, that would repeatedly place civilization on the brink of nuclear self-destruction. Meanwhile, new developments in planes, as well as new income from military contracts for private companies like Boeing, allowed them to quickly develop larger and faster aircrafts. This would eventually lead to the creation of the jet engine and turn the commercial flight industry on its head by enabling quick travel across entire continents and seas. The Pacific War and its new technologies had profound effects not just at the time, but even in the world we know today.